For today's video, I'm setting up a filterless Walstad Method cherry shrimp tank, and I'll be posting monthly updates to track how it develops over time. Without giving too much away, let's just say I made a few mistakes along the way with this one, and it's definitely been a learning experience, but I do think I've managed to overcome all of the problems and get the tank back on track. For this build, I'm using a 25 litre or 6.6 US gallon tank, which is a great size for cherry shrimp. To improve the visuals, I added window privacy film as a background to the tank. For the substrate, I started with about ½ an inch of regular topsoil with no additives or chemicals. This forms a nutrient-rich base which will provide micronutrients for the plants but also act as a natural CO2 source when the waste-eating bacteria start to break down organic matter in the soil. I left a small gap where I plan to place the hardscape to avoid putting soil directly beneath it, but this is optional and is not required. Next, I added a 1-inch cap of fine gravel. This helps keep the soil in place, preventing it from clouding the water while also trapping nutrients in place in the substrate. This has a grain size of around 2 mm, so it's right on the border between being fine gravel and coarse sand. The top layer of gravel stays well oxygenated with this type of setup, making it a great surface for colonies of beneficial microorganisms if needed to help support the cycle. Moving on to hardscape, and this part is optional, but I do think it helps to really enhance the visual appeal of a Walstad Method tank. For this build, I'm using lava rock, which is a budget-friendly and easy-to-find option, as well as cobo wood, which can be a little bit more expensive and harder to find, specifically if you want some good-looking wood. Spiderwood is still a great affordable alternative to cobo wood that's a lot easier to find and usually has a far lower price tag. To assemble the hardscape, I placed pieces of kitchen roll between the rocks and wood and then used some Horizon Aquatics aquarium safe glue to form a bond between the two. I also tried to make sure that there was at least 2 points of contact between each of the pieces of lava rock and the wood to make sure it would have increased stability. Next up, I chose to start adding the epiphyte plants to the hardscape before I put it in the tank so I have more room to work with. I will leave a full plant list in the video description if you want to use some of the same ones I'm using. That said, I am using a few in vitro tissue culture cups, and in hindsight I do think this could have been a mistake, but I'll explain more as we work through the video. I glued down some Anubias nanocoin to act as a centerpiece plant because I love the deep green colour of it and it does get quite big relative to this tank size. Anubias nanocoin is very beginner friendly in my experience, but it does have a very slow growth rate, so it won't do much in terms of natural filtration for the tank. I do want to quickly point out there is some browning on the leaves of the Anubias at this point, so the browning you see in the future is nothing to do with what I did with it, it's just the state the plant came in. Then I split the Bucephalandra Biblis tissue culture cup into several different clumps and glued them to different parts of the hardscape. You get a lot of plant mass in these little cups, so there's more than enough for a tank of this size. The Horizon Aquatics glue dries very quickly, which made it easy to get everything glued in place and then get the hardscape into the tank. As you can see, I positioned the hardscape slightly off-centre to leave room for fast-grown plants in the back left, which will serve as natural filtration for the tank. Finally, I added a third piece of lava rock to the front left of the tank just to break things up a little bit, but this is optional and can be skipped. Moving on to planting the rest of the tank, and I did make a small mistake at this stage. I forgot to add a small amount of water beforehand to help degas the substrate and make planting easier by wetting the substrate, and I have seen people say it doesn't make that much of a difference, but personally I really do think it does, so usually I like to add about 1 inch of water at this stage just to make things as easy as possible. I started by planting some Rotala H'Ra behind the hardscape, which is from an in vitro cup. I broke this into clumps and then planted it in place, and since it's a stem plant, the plant will be left to grow, and then I'll probably trim it and replant the healthy tops into the substrate just to fill out this back section a little more. Next, I added a bunch of Hygrophila Siamensis 53B to the back left corner, and this was meant to be the fastest grown plant in the setup and be the main natural filtration system. After that, I moved to the middle ground of the setup and added some Staurogyne Repens from another in vitro cup, as this is a compact stem plant that can bush out and look amazing once it's filled in. Then I added Cryptocoryne Albida Brown to the foreground to bring in some extra colours and textures to the foreground of the tank. To finish off the planting, I added some Lilaeopsis Brasiliensis to the rest of the foreground and intended this to serve as a carpeting plant for this scape once it establishes itself and spreads. With all of the initial plants in place, I laid some bubble wrap over the substrate to help diffuse the water flow from my siphon and then filled the tank with water. The bubble wrap just makes sure that the water flow doesn't mix the substrate layers, and this is just regular tap water. It's nothing special, but I did add some tap water conditioner to it. Finally, I added some red root floaters to the surface, but I was hoping to mix a few different floating plants into this, but everything else was out of stock when I placed the order. This is what the tank was looking like after the initial planting, and I was really happy with how things were looking at this point, but let's just say things didn't stay this way for long. The tank is using a Chihiros A2 light and a leftover AQUARIUMS stock heater I had left over from another tank, which will work fine in here, but it doesn't have a filter or any other source of active water flow. Moving on to month 1, and there really wasn't many major problems to start with. I began by double checking the water temperature to make sure the heater was functioning correctly, as I haven't used it in about a year, but everything seemed safe and stable. Then I moved on to checking the ammonia levels, and they were a little high, coming in at 1.0 ppm, which is around double what I'd expect for this setup with this specific soil and this specific capping layer. So I went ahead and did a 50% water change just to bring those ammonia levels down, because I was aware that I had a lot of in vitro cup plants in the tank which can be sensitive to ammonia. For the first few days, everything looked fine in the tank, and by day 3, ammonia was holding steady at around 0.5 ppm, which is typical for this setup, and I plan to do water changes every 2 to 3 days anyway to manage ammonia to try and give the in vitro cups the best chance possible. As you can see, everything was starting to grow towards the light source for the tank as well, showing everything is working as planned. On day 5, the tank did develop a bacterial bloom, but I do suspect that this was simply due to leaving some extra grow gel on one of the in vitro cups. It is a common issue that I have in my tanks, and in my experience, usually leaving the tank for 24 to 48 hours usually lets us clear up. But since it was water change day, I did another 50% water change anyway, just to help it clear up and get those excess nutrients out of the tank. By day 7, I did notice that the ammonia had spiked up again to 1.0 ppm, and this didn't really make sense because after a week of the topsoil leaching water-soluble ammonia into the water, levels should be going down, especially with water changes rather than going up. Because this tank's on one of my aquarium racks, I was watching one of my other tanks when I noticed some bubbles coming out of the substrate in this particular tank. Now, it's hard to prove, but my current theory is that the bubbles working their way out of the substrate was somehow releasing more water-soluble ammonia from the soil, spiking levels up a little bit, but I'm really not sure what was happening. By this time, algae was already starting to form on the tank glass too, and this is actually a good sign, even though it puts a lot of people off, because it shows that life is starting to take hold in your new ecosystem. But I decided to clean the algae off the front glass panel of the tank just to make it easier to see what was happening in the tank, because I did have a couple of problems already. Thankfully, by the week 2 mark, ammonia levels had stabilised at 0 ppm and things seemed relatively normal, but not all of the plants were thriving. Unfortunately, my Lilaeopsis Brasiliensis had started to melt and the tips of the Staurogyne Repens were starting to turn white. I suspected that the Lilaeopsis was struggling due to it being an in vitro cup and the early ammonia spikes potentially causing ammonia toxicity, resulting in the plant melting. As for the Staurogyne Repens, I did think that the white tips on the leaves were probably due to the intense lighting, but the ammonia could have played a role in this too. By day 11, the Lilaeopsis Brasiliensis had melted so much that the siphon for my water changes was able to suck it directly out of the tank with minimal effort, showing that the plant was failing. The Staurogyne Repens was also deteriorating, so I decided to manually remove it to prevent excess organics polluting the water. I did order some Salvinia natans from Link's Ponds Plants, and although they didn't look bad when I first got them, after a week of quarantine to make sure there was no snail eggs on the plants, they really did take a turn for the worse. I decided to add them to the tank anyway to see if they could recover, but I really wasn't expecting much. This is what the tank looked like after removing the remaining Lilaeopsis and Staurogyne Repens, and as you can see, algae is starting to form on the tank and slowly starting to take over. By day 21, water parameters were still stable, but the algae problem was consistently getting worse, and I decided that was probably the light intensity that was causing the issue, so I decided to reduce the lighting intensity from the Chihiros A2 down to 50% max intensity, because this is more than double the usual light intensity that I work with my aquariums. I also noticed that my Hygrophila Siamensis 53B hadn't grown at all in this tank, and this was strange since it's grown well in one of my other tanks, but the other tank does have Sirius stone, which raises KH and buffers a higher pH in that specific tank. I have seen people say that the Hygrophila genus can do better with harder water, so I am suspecting that's something that's happening here, and it might just take longer to establish itself before it starts growing, but it was basically useless in this tank at this stage. So to address the problem, I picked up some Limnophila Sessiliflora, which is one of the best plants for Walstad Method tanks in my opinion, and it consistently does well in my tap water parameters, and its rapid growth rate helps it outcompete algae for nutrients. I did give the glass a quick wipe down to remove algae so I could remove it during the water change before planting the Limnophila into the tank. Even though the ammonia and nitrite were consistently reading 0 ppm in the tank, I still don't like to add shrimp this early in a new Walstad Method tank because the soil can leak other nutrients such as copper, which I don't actually have a test for. So just to be safe, I do usually do water changes through month 1 and then add livestock in month 2, just so the water soluble copper in the substrate, if there is any, can work its way out of the system and keep my shrimp safe. I removed the 53B, and a lot of the stems had roots growing on them, but there was just no stem or leaf development, which is what we need to take care of the toxins in the water. I did decide to replant 3 of the 53B stems back into the tank just to monitor it to get more data on how it performs in my tap water for future setups. Then I planted as much Limnophila Sessiliflora as possible behind them, packing as many stems out of the pot in the tank as I could. I do have a full article on why I think Limnophila Sessiliflora is one of the best plants for filterless Walstad tanks, and I link it in the description, but in short, it's just how fast this plant can grow. The next day, the Limnophila had already started to grow towards the light, and looking back, I should probably have cut the initial stems in half just to get as much plant mass in the tank as possible, but even with the current stem plan, it was making a noticeable difference. Unfortunately, I did notice that my Bucephalandra Biblis had started to melt away, but again, this is an in vitro cut plant, and the ammonia spikes back at the start could have stressed the plant out and caused the issues. To help both the tank's aesthetics and natural filtration capacity, I did get a 3D printed emergent plant holder from my friend who runs MMS designs on Etsy, which I link to in the description. I used some dowel wood as plant stem supports, a small grow light that's about $10 off Amazon, and then I got some Tradescantia Zebrina and Monstera Adansonii to fill in the empty space in my aquarium rack. As this grows, its roots will take up excess nutrients from the tank to support the healthy growth of the plants. The holder mounts to an aquarium really easily, and the built-in light holder makes everything neat and tidy. This is what the tank was looking like with the emergent plants in place, but as you can see, the algae is still growing, but it's definitely at a slow pace. Fast forward a couple of days and the Limnophila Sessiliflora stems had already almost doubled in size. This is a clear sign it's doing its job of sucking up a lot of excess toxins out of the water and using them as nutrients to grow and outcompeting the algae and purifying the tank to keep shrimp safe in the future. The Salvinia natans was just getting worse, so I decided to remove it along with a lot of the excess redroot floaters that had propagated itself in the tank. Since this tank is only 25 centimeters or 10 inches tall max, and then there's 1.5 inches of substrate in the bottom, the Limnophila can outgrow this tank's height very quickly. So I decided to remove it, trim the healthy tops and replant them to try and keep things as compact as possible, while also increasing the number of stems that I had in the tank for natural filtration. This is what the tank was looking like a day after trimming, and you can see how short the Limnophila is at this stage, and keep in mind this was a few days ago from the time of recording this video, so trying to gauge how tall this is will be important for later. Finally, I did decide to add a small USB water pump to increase water flow in the tank to try and make things as easy as possible for the future of this tank setup. In hindsight, I do wish I'd added this from the start because it could have made things a lot easier, but in my experience, the tanks that give you the most trouble are the ones that you learn the most from. So fast forward to today, and this is what the tank is looking like, and I know that it's looking rough, but things are actually very stable in its current condition and I'm happy with how the tank's turned around. As I said, it's only been a few days since I last trimmed and replanted the Limnophila Sessiliflora, but as you can see, it's already grown at a rapid pace, just showing how quickly this plant can grow. The Rotala H'Ra is doing surprisingly well too, especially considering it came from an in vitro cup like a lot of the other plants that melted. But even though I am new to Rotala H'Ra, I keep a lot of Rotala rotundifolia and I've had Rotala orange juice previously, and both of those were very hardy, easy to keep plants too. I am going to be placing a new plant order early next week, so I'll probably replace the Bucephalandra, the Cryptocoryne Albida brown and the Bulbitis bilbis in this tank that didn't make it. I'm not sure if I'll bring the Staurogyne Repens back for this tank or go with Blixia japonica because I really want to give it a try, but Staurogyne Repens and Blixia will both work in the next tank I have planned anyway, so it doesn't really matter, I'm just flipping between the two of them right now in my head. Now the tank isn't stocked yet, but I do plan to start adding cherry shrimp gradually over the next week, and technically I could add them all at once if I really wanted, but I rather introduce them in stages, so if anything unexpected does happen like fatalities, I can stop the stocking and save the rest of the shrimp. I'm not buying new cherry shrimp for this tank either. I'm going to split my oldest cherry shrimp colony and move half of them over to this tank. My goal is to have a backup colony of those shrimp in case anything happens to the original setup. I know that I can buy more cherry shrimp if needed, they're really not that expensive, but this particular colony is special to me as it's the one that got me back into the hobby, and I do want to try and keep their line going for as long as possible. So finally, I want to touch on how I could have potentially avoided most of the problems that I had with this tank, but again, this is all in hindsight and theoretical, but I do think a lot of this could have made things easier. First off, I do think that adding a source of active water flow like the USB tank from day one would have kept things very easy. Since setting this cherry shrimp tank up, I've built 2 more tanks with their videos coming soon, and I've added active water flow from the start, and it's made a huge difference, especially with the in vitro plants in those tanks. It just helps to circulate the water, ensuring it comes into frequent contact with fast-growing plants so they can absorb as many toxins as possible from the water to keep it safe. Speaking of fast-growing plants, in hindsight I didn't really have any in this tank. The fastest growing plant I ended up with for month 1 was red root floaters, and even then that's still a relatively slow growing plant compared to something like duckweed, spiridella or water lettuce. While the Rotala H'Ra is growing at a decent pace now, being an in vitro cup it did have to establish itself before it started to grow in the tank. As I covered earlier, the Hygrophila 53B was basically useless in this tank, although it grows well in one of my other setups. In this one, it was basically wasted space that offered minimal value. So a simple fix would have been starting with plants that I already know thrive in my tap water like Limnophila Sessiliflora, Rotala rotundifolia or pearlweed and things like that. These have always been decent grows in my tap water and would have offered more value than the 53B. Also, even though the floating plants were out of stock when I placed this initial order, I could have easily transferred duckweed, Amazon frogbit or water lettuce over from one of my other tanks to this one to make things as easy as possible. As for the in vitro plants that comes in the little tissue culture cups, I'm honestly leaning more towards holding off planting them in future Walstad Method tanks until month 2 or even month 3. They can work like the Bucephalandra Red that I added to my Walstad betta fish tank, which doesn't have any source of active water flow in it, proving that they can work, but it's just an unnecessary risk. If you do add in vitro cup plants to the tank and they melt, then they're just going to dump more organics into the water, raising ammonia levels and making the whole cycling process harder to stabilise. On top of that, in vitro cups are usually more expensive than their potted varieties, so it's also a waste of money. Then there's the lighting, and I am new to higher powered lighting because I usually stick with the more affordable stuff, but I just wanted to see what would happen if I ran this at full intensity from the start. Looking back, I honestly think a Ciora SR616 or another affordable entry-level light would have been able to avoid some of the problems with algae growth and things like that in this tank. It's far more affordable and delivers a similar lumen output to what I'm currently running the Chyhyrrhos light on after dialing down its settings due to all of the algae growth. That said, I am still curious to see if the higher output of the Chyhyrrhos A2 can help turn the Rotala H'Ra red as it establishes itself in the tank more and more, but time will tell with that one, and it's optional. Red plants are not essential in Walstad Method tanks, and you could argue they're actually detracting from it because you could put fast-grown green plants there instead. But at this point, everything does seem to have stabilised and the algae is slowly starting to fade, and once I put the cherry shrimp in there, they're going to beast mode the algae and eat it all within a week or two anyway, so I am looking forward to seeing what happens in month 2. Anyway guys, that brings the video to an end. Thanks for watching, have a good day, and hopefully you'll have a smoother month 1 with your own Walstad tanks than I did with this one.